The real reason. Horus betrayed the Emperor. In Warhammer 40K, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war. But before the endless conflict that defines the 41st millennium, there was a moment when everything could have been different. A single decision that would damn humanity to 10,000 years of suffering. A betrayal so profound that it would crack the very foundations of the Imperium and usher in an age of darkness from which mankind would never truly recover. The Horus heresy stands as the most catastrophic civil war in human history. Brother fought brother, sons turned against their father, and the dreams of a united galaxy died in fire and blood. But why? What could drive the Emperor's most beloved son, his chosen war master, the Primarch who stood as the pinnacle of everything the Great Crusade represented, to turn his back on everything he had built and seek to destroy the very Imperium he had helped forge? The answer is not simple. It never is when examining the fall of heroes. The story of Horus Lupercal's betrayal is one woven from threads of ambition and pride, manipulation and genuine grievance, cosmic conspiracy and all too human weakness. It is a tragedy in the truest sense, where every character plays their part in an inevitable spiral toward catastrophe, where good intentions pave the road to damnation, and where the seeds of destruction were planted long before anyone realized a harvest of ruin was growing. Before we can understand why Horus fell, we must first understand who he was. Not the demon-possessed warlord who would ultimately die on the bridge of the vengeful spirit, but the man who stood as the Emperor's right hand, the Primarch who embodied everything the Great Crusade aspired to achieve. Horus Lupercal was, by nearly every measure, perfect. Among 20 genetically engineered demigods created to lead humanity's reconquest of the stars, he stood first. Not merely first discovered, though that was true, but first in capability, first in success, first in the hearts of his brothers and the warriors who served under him. Where some Primarchs excelled in specific domains, Horus demonstrated mastery across every aspect of warfare and leadership. As a tactician, he was brilliant. He could assess a battlefield with the same analytical precision as Guilliman, yet possessed an intuitive understanding of psychological warfare that let him win victories before the first shot was fired. He knew when to strike with overwhelming force and when a surgical application of violence would achieve compliance with minimal bloodshed. His conquest record spoke for itself. World after world fell to the Lunar Wolves, later renamed the Sons of Horus in his honor, and each victory seemed effortless, a testament to perfect planning and flawless execution. But Horus was more than just a military genius. He possessed a charisma that transcended the already superhuman presence all Primarchs commanded. When he spoke, people listened. When he made promises, they believed. He could inspire fanatical loyalty in his warriors, while simultaneously charming diplomats and administrators who found other Primarchs too martial, too alien, too inhuman. Where Angron terrified, where Mortarion disgusted, where the lion inspired cold respect, Horus made people want to follow him. He made them believe that the future would be glorious, that their sacrifices mattered, that they were part of something greater than themselves. His relationships with his brother Primarchs demonstrated this gift perhaps more than anything else. In a family of demigods, each convinced of their own superiority, each carrying the weight of being created to lead, Horus navigated the complex web of rivalries and alliances with seemingly effortless grace. He was close friends with Sanguinius, whose beauty and nobility matched his own. He earned the respect of the taciturn Ferrus Manus. He could speak strategy with Guilliman, philosophy with Magnus, and maintain cordial relations even with more difficult brothers like Perturabo and Mortarion. Not all loved him, but most respected him. And that respect was no small achievement among beings who had been designed to be supreme. Most importantly, Horus had the complete trust and love of the Emperor himself. Among all his sons, The master of mankind seemed to favor Horus above the rest. Where he might criticize Lorgar's slowness or Russ's savagery, where he kept secrets from Magnus, or maintained a certain distance from Gilliman's empire building, with Horus, he seemed to share everything. The emperor confided in Horus, sought his counsel, and demonstrated a warmth toward his first-found son that few others received. This relationship defined Horus in ways he perhaps did not fully understand. To be the emperor's favorite was to stand at the center of the greatest undertaking in human history. The Great Crusade was not merely a military campaign. It was the reforging of mankind's scattered civilization into a unified whole, the reclamation of humanity's birthright among the stars. And Horus was its shining exemplar, the living proof that the emperor's vision could be achieved. When the emperor named him War Master after the triumph at Ulanor, granting him supreme command of all imperial military forces, it seemed like the natural culmination of everything Horus had achieved. The title was unprecedented. Never before had the emperor elevated one of his sons above the others. Never before had he granted such sweeping authority to anyone save himself. The appointment spoke to absolute trust, to recognition not just of Horus's abilities, but of his loyalty and judgment. Standing before his brother Primarchs, accepting the office of War Master, Horus must have felt that he had achieved everything a being could aspire to. He was the emperor's chosen instrument, entrusted with completing the Great Crusade itself. The weight of that responsibility was immense, but so was the glory. He would finish what his father had started. He would bring every human world back into the fold of the Imperium. His name would echo through history as the one who united mankind. But in that moment of triumph, seeds of future catastrophe were already germinating. Because immediately after bestowing this ultimate honor, immediately after publicly declaring Horus his most trusted son, the emperor made a decision that would shatter everything. He announced his intention to return to Terra. He declared that he would be leaving the Great Crusade in Horus's capable hands, while he pursued a project of such importance that he could not even share its nature with his War Master. The emperor was going home, leaving Horus to command alone, and he refused to say why. The abandonment. When the father left. Imagine the weight of that moment. You are Horus Lupercal, newly appointed War Master, standing before the assembled hosts of the Imperium's mightiest warriors. Your father has just given you the greatest honor imaginable, and in the same breath, he has told you that he is leaving. Not just leaving you in command, which would be honor enough, but leaving entirely. Returning to Terra, abandoning the Great Crusade itself, the work that has consumed 2 centuries of blood and sacrifice. And he will not tell you why. For 200 years, the Emperor had led the Great Crusade personally. He had stood at the head of his armies, conquering world after world, reuniting scattered human civilizations under the banner of the Imperium. He had found each of his Primarch sons and brought them into the fold, watching them grow into the leaders he had designed them to be. The Great Crusade was not just a military campaign. It was his great work, the fulfillment of plans that stretched back millennia. And now, with victory tantalizingly close, with the majority of human-settled space finally brought into compliance, the Emperor was walking away. The official reason given was vague. The Emperor spoke of important work on Terra, of projects that required his personal attention, of matters that would benefit all of humanity. But he shared no details. Even to Horus, his most trusted son, the War Master who now commanded all Imperial forces, he revealed nothing of what he intended to do. The secrecy was absolute and, to many, inexplicable. From the Emperor's perspective, this secrecy made perfect sense. What he was attempting was the Webway project, perhaps the most ambitious undertaking in human history. Deep beneath the Imperial Palace on Terra, using an ancient artifact called the Golden Throne, the Emperor was working to breach the dimensional barriers and gain access to the Eldari Webway, that vast network of tunnels that existed between real space and the warp. His goal was nothing less than to free humanity from its dependence on warp travel. For millennia, human civilization had been constrained by the necessity of traveling through the Imperium, that roiling sea of psychic energy where the laws of physics held no sway and the predatory entities of chaos dwelt. Every journey through the warp was a risk. Ships could be lost, delayed by centuries, or worse, corrupted by the touch of the ruinous powers. Communication across the Imperium relied on psychers and astropaths, humans with psychic abilities, who were themselves vulnerable to demonic possession and the whispers of chaos. The webway would change everything. Its tunnels existed in a stable dimension, protected from the warp by ancient alien technology. Once humanity gained access to this network and expanded it to connect all Imperial worlds, travel would become instantaneous and safe. The Imperium would no longer need navigators to chart courses through the warp or astropaths to send messages across the void. Humanity would be freed from its greatest vulnerability. Moreover, the Webway project was part of a larger vision. The Emperor understood that humanity was evolving into a psychic species. More humans were being born with psychic abilities with each passing generation. This evolution was inevitable and necessary for humanity to achieve its full potential, but it was also dangerous, because psychic power came from the warp, and the warp was the domain of chaos. Every psyker was a potential gateway for demonic incursion. The Webway would solve this problem. If humanity could be shielded from the warp, if the species could evolve into its psychic potential while protected from chaos, then mankind would ascend to become the dominant force in the galaxy. They would surpass even the ancient Aeldari, who had fallen into depravity and created a chaos god through their excesses. The Emperor would guide humanity through this evolution, shepherding the species to a glorious future where they would never know the touch of chaos. It was a plan of breathtaking scope and ambition. It would take centuries to complete, require the personal attention of the Emperor himself, maintaining the psychic wards around the human-built portions of the Webway, and represent the culmination of everything he had worked toward since the Age of Strife. But he could not tell his sons about it. The Webway project had to remain secret for multiple reasons. The navigators, those mutant humans whose unique abilities allowed them to chart courses through the warp, would view the project as a threat to their monopoly on interstellar travel. They were powerful and politically connected, and if they learned that the Emperor intended to make their services obsolete, they might take action to sabotage the work. Indeed, the Paternova of the Navigators would later dispatch an agent to destroy a prototype device called Dark Glass, proving the Emperor's concerns justified. More crucially, if Chaos learned what the Emperor was attempting, the Dark Gods would do everything in their power to stop him. The Webway project threatened their very existence. If humanity could be severed from the warp, if mankind could evolve without exposure to chaos, then the ruinous powers would be starved of the psychic energy they fed upon. The Emperor's plan was not merely to protect humanity, but to eventually destroy chaos itself by denying its sustenance. So the Emperor kept his secrets, even from his most trusted sons. And in doing so, he planted the seeds of catastrophe. Because to Horus and his brothers, the Emperor's withdrawal looked like abandonment. It seemed inexplicable that the Emperor would return to Terra at this crucial moment. The Great Crusade was not finished. Vast swathes of the galaxy remained unconquered. Alien empires still threatened human worlds. The work that had consumed 2 centuries of effort, that had cost millions of lives, that represented the greatest achievement in human history, was incomplete. And the Emperor was walking away from it, turning his back on the crusade, on his sons, on the warriors who had bled for his vision. He was leaving them to finish the work while he pursued mysterious projects. He refused to explain. Projects that, apparently, were more important than the conquest of the galaxy itself, more important than standing beside the sons he had created, more important than the bonds of trust and shared purpose that had sustained the Great Crusade through 2 centuries of war. The psychological impact on Horus cannot be overstated. For his entire existence as the emperor's son, Horus had been defined by their relationship. He was the first found, the most favored, the one who walked closest to his father. The emperor had shared his vision with Horus, confided his plans, trusted him with responsibilities that few others received. Their bond was not merely that of creator and creation, or even father and son, but something approaching true partnership. And now, the emperor was shutting him out. Horus had been given the title of War Master, yes, but what did that honor mean if the emperor no longer trusted him with the truth? What did it say about their relationship that the emperor would not explain why he was leaving? Did Horus not deserve to know? Had he not earned that level of trust through 2 centuries of perfect service? The questions gnawed at him, creating doubt where none had existed before. If the emperor truly valued him, truly saw him as the worthy son and heir to his vision, why the secrecy? What was so important that it required the emperor to abandon the Great Crusade at its most critical moment? Why could he not at least explain to his war master, his most trusted son, what he was attempting? The doubt was a seed, small at first, barely acknowledged even to himself. But it was there, planted in fertile soil, ready to grow when watered by further grievances, and tended by those who sought to see it bloom into betrayal. And there were other grievances coming, born from the emperor's other decision upon returning to Terra. Because the emperor did not merely withdraw from the Great Crusade, he fundamentally restructured how the Imperium would be governed, in a way that seemed calculated to insult and diminish the Primarchs who had conquered it in his name. The Council of Terra, the ultimate insult. Throughout the Great Crusade, the Imperium had been governed by the War Council. This body consisted of the Emperor himself at its head, along with his closest advisors and the Primarchs. It was a military command structure befitting a campaign of conquest, where decisions were made by those who understood warfare and had proven themselves in battle. The War Council decided strategy, allocated resources, determined which worlds would be brought into compliance and by what means. It was, in essence, the government of the Imperium. The Primarchs had seats on the War Council by right. They were not merely generals leading their legions. They were the Emperor's sons, gene-crafted demigods designed to be the leaders of humanity's future. They had conquered worlds, built empires, and proven themselves worthy of authority. The War Council recognized this, giving them a voice in the Imperium's direction, alongside the Emperor and his most trusted advisors, like Malcador, the Sigillite. Then the Emperor dissolved the War Council and replaced it with something else entirely. The Council of Terra was to be the new governing body of the Imperium. It would consist of civilian administrators, bureaucrats, Terran nobles, and representatives of various imperial organizations. It would handle the day-to-day business of running a galactic empire, managing the complex web of trade, taxation, resource allocation, and legal structures that a million worlds required. It would, the Emperor declared, be the Imperium's true government, the body that would administrate all the territories that the Great Crusade had won. And the Primarchs would have no place on it. The decision made a certain logical sense from a governance perspective. The Emperor understood that an empire of 1,000,000 worlds could not be run by a military command structure indefinitely. The Great Crusade was ending, or at least entering its final phases. Soon, the emphasis would shift from conquest to consolidation, from bringing worlds into compliance to managing them effectively. That required different skills than those possessed by warriors, even warriors as capable as the Primarchs. Moreover, the Primarchs were too powerful to be given formal roles in civilian government. They were demigods, beings of immense strength, intelligence, and presence. Put them in charge of running the Imperium, and they would inevitably dominate it completely. The civilian population would have no voice, no agency. The Imperium would become a military dictatorship, ruled by genetically engineered supermen who, for all their capabilities, were not human in the conventional sense. The Emperor wanted the Imperium to be governed by and for normal humans. He had created the Primarchs as tools to unite humanity, but once that unification was complete, he intended for mankind to govern itself. The Primarchs would continue to serve, of course, as military leaders and defenders of the Imperium, but they would not rule it. That power would rest with the civilian government, accountable to the people it governed. It was a noble vision, one that recognized the inherent problem with rule by superhuman beings who could never truly understand the lives of baseline humans. But to the Primarchs, scattered across the galaxy at the frontiers of the Great Crusade, the creation of the Council of Terror looked like nothing less than a profound betrayal and insult. They had conquered the Imperium. They and their legions had bled for 2 centuries, bringing world after world into compliance. They had sacrificed, fought, and died in service to the Emperor's vision. They had built this Imperium with their own hands, literally fought for every world it contained. And now, just as victory approached, the Emperor was handing control of what they had won to bureaucrats and administrators who had never set foot outside the Sol system. The resentment was particularly acute for Primarchs who had strong ideas about how the Imperium should be run. Perturabo of the Iron Warriors, who had spent decades in thankless garrison duties, saw it as confirmation that his sacrifices were not valued. Mortarion of the Death Guard, who hated tyrants and had believed he was fighting to free humanity from oppression, found himself subordinate to distant officials who knew nothing of the worlds he had conquered. Even Guilliman, who excelled at administration and had built the realm of Ultramar into a model of effective governance, must have felt the slight of being excluded from the highest levels of imperial government. But for Horus, the blow was perhaps most severe of all. He was the War Master. The Emperor had entrusted him with supreme military command. He was supposed to complete the Great Crusade, to bring the last unconquered worlds into the Imperium, to fulfill his father's vision. And while he was out there, fighting and bleeding and winning victories, the fruits of those victories would be handed over to people the Emperor apparently trusted more than his own sons. The Council of Terror represented everything that Horus was beginning to fear. It suggested that the Primarchs were temporary solutions, tools to be used during the conquest phase, and then set aside once the real work of governance began. It implied that the Emperor did not see them as true heirs to his Imperium, but merely as very effective warriors who would eventually become obsolete. What role would the Primarchs have in a peacetime Imperium run by civilian administrators? Would they simply be relegated to garrison duties, keeping watch over worlds that others governed? Would all their achievements, all their sacrifices, amount to nothing more than being the Emperor's attack dogs, to be kennelled once the hunt was over? These fears were not entirely unfounded. There were whispers throughout the legions that once the Great Crusade was complete, the Space Marines would be disbanded or at least drastically reduced in size. After all, what need would a peaceful Imperium have for hundreds of thousands of superhuman warriors bred for conquest? The legions had been created for war, and if there was no more war to fight, then perhaps they would be seen as threats rather than assets, dangerous tools that needed to be disposed of before they caused problems. Horus tried to push these thoughts aside. He had always been loyal, always trusted his father's judgment. Surely the Emperor had reasons for structuring the Imperium this way. Surely there was a larger plan that would eventually be revealed. But the doubt was there, growing larger with each passing solar month, fed by the silence from Terra, by the lack of explanation, by the growing distance between father and son. And there were those who noticed that doubt, who saw the opportunity it represented, who had been waiting for exactly this moment to plant their poison in fertile ground. Because the Chaos Gods had been working toward Horus's fall long before he ever realized he was vulnerable. The architects of heresy, Lorgar's fall. To understand how Horus fell, we must first understand that his betrayal did not begin with him. The conspiracy that would bring the War Master to chaos was already decades in the making, carefully orchestrated by the Primarch Lorgar Aurelian and his word-bearers Legion. And Lorgar's own fall had begun with a wound that cut as deeply as any blade ever could. The destruction of everything he believed in, ordered by his own father. Lorgar was unique among the Primarchs. While his brothers were warriors first, defined by their martial prowess and tactical genius, Lorgar was a preacher, a prophet, a seeker of divine truth. Raised on the desert world of Colchis by priests of an ancient religion, he had always been driven by spiritual questions. What was the nature of the universe? What higher powers existed beyond mortal comprehension? What truths could be found through faith and devotion? When the Emperor found him, Lorgar believed he had discovered the answer to all those questions. The Emperor was the divine made manifest, a being of such power and vision that he could only be a god. Lorgar reorganized the entire faith of Colchis around worshipping the Emperor, and when he joined the Great Crusade, he brought that fervent devotion with him. The Word-bearers fought differently than other legions. They did not merely bring worlds into compliance, they converted them, establishing cults of emperor worship, building vast cathedrals and monuments, writing elaborate texts that proclaimed the emperor's divinity and the spiritual salvation that came from serving him. Every world the Word-bearers conquered was transformed into a shrine to the god emperor, its population taught to revere the master of mankind as the one true deity worthy of human devotion. Lorgar poured everything he had into this mission. He wrote the Lectitio Divinitatis, a massive tome laying out the theological foundations for emperor worship, arguing that only a being of divine nature could have accomplished what the emperor had achieved. He spent months on conquered worlds, personally overseeing the construction of temples and the establishment of proper religious practices. He was slower than his brother Primarchs in terms of conquest speed, but what he lacked in efficiency, he made up for in completeness. The worlds the Word-bearers brought into compliance stayed compliant, their populations fanatically loyal to the Emperor through the power of religious fervor. For almost a century, the Emperor said nothing about this. He never praised Lorgar's efforts, but he never condemned them either. Lorgar took this silence as acceptance, perhaps even as approval. Surely, if the Emperor truly disapproved of being worshipped as a god, he would say something. Surely he would not allow his son to spend decades spreading this faith if it was truly against his wishes. But the Emperor was troubled by what the Word-bearers were doing. One of the core tenets of the imperial truth, the philosophical foundation of the Great Crusade, was that there were no gods, no supernatural powers, no divine beings worthy of worship. Religion was superstition, a relic of humanity's ignorant past that had to be swept away. The Emperor's goal was not merely to unite mankind politically, but to free the species from the chains of false belief, to usher in an age of reason and scientific understanding. He tolerated Lorgar's behavior initially, perhaps out of love for his son, perhaps because the words the Word-bearers brought into compliance stayed loyal and productive. But as the Great Crusade progressed, as the Emperor's frustration with Lorgar's slow pace grew, as reports piled up of worlds where the Word-bearers were spending more time preaching than conquering, he finally decided that enough was enough. The Emperor's response was not a private reprimand or a stern conversation with Lorgar. It was a public humiliation on a scale that beggared belief. The planet Kor was home to Monarchia, a city that the Word-bearers considered their greatest achievement. It was called the Perfect City, a place of stunning beauty where every structure was a temple or monument to the Emperor's glory. The people of Kor worshipped the God Emperor with a fervor that brought tears to Lorgar's eyes. It was everything he had worked toward, a shining example of what the Imperium could become if humanity embraced the truth of the Emperor's divinity. The Emperor ordered it destroyed. He dispatched the entire Ultramarines Legion, 100,000 Space Marines strong, along with a force of Legio Custodes and Malcador the Sigillite himself, to Kor. Their orders were clear and brutal: raze Monarchia to the ground, level every temple, every cathedral, every monument, reduce the perfect city to ash and rubble as a lesson in the folly of false religion. The Ultramarines, under Rabut Guilliman's command, carried out their orders with characteristic efficiency. They gave the population time to evacuate, because this punishment was not meant for the citizens of Kur. It was meant for Lorgar. When the bombardment began, it lasted for hours, systematically obliterating the city that had taken decades to build. The devastation covered a quarter of the continent, leaving nothing but smoking ruins where the perfect city had stood. Then, the Emperor summoned the entire Word-Bearers Legion to Kur. All 100,000 of them called back from their campaigns across the galaxy to stand in the ashes of what they had built. They arrived to find the Ultramarines waiting for them, standing in judgment over the ruins of Monarchia. And then, the Emperor himself appeared. What happened next would scar Lorgar and every Word-Bearer for the rest of their existence. The Emperor, using his immense psychic power, forced the entire Legion to kneel. Not by ordering them, not by asking them, but by simply overwhelming their will with his own. 100,000 Space Marines, including their Primarch, were driven to their knees in the ashes of their greatest achievement, powerless to resist, humiliated before their brother Legion. Then the Emperor spoke. He told them that they had failed him, that everything they had done in his name was worthless, that their devotion was a lie, their faith a delusion, their achievements nothing but monuments to falsehood. He explained that the mission of the Space Marines was to bring worlds into compliance, not to spread religious nonsense. He made it absolutely clear that he was not a god, did not want to be worshipped as a god, and found their efforts to deify him to be a profound disappointment. The Emperor's reasoning, from his perspective, made perfect sense. He was trying to free humanity from religious superstition, and here was his own son spreading exactly the kind of faith-based nonsense that had poisoned human civilization for millennia. He needed to make it absolutely clear that such behavior would not be tolerated, even from a Primarch. The public nature of the humiliation was necessary to ensure that every word-bearer understood this was not acceptable, that spreading Emperor worship was against everything the Imperium stood for. But to Lorgar, it was the destruction of his entire world. Everything he had believed, everything he had worked toward, everything that gave his existence meaning, had been revealed as a mistake, worse than a mistake, a failure. He had spent a century serving what he thought his father wanted, spreading what he believed was the truth of the Emperor's divinity, only to be told that he had completely misunderstood everything. The psychological impact was catastrophic. Lorgar fell into a deep depression, withdrawing from his Legion and from the Great Crusade itself. He was not angry at first, just broken, unable to comprehend how he could have been so wrong about something so fundamental. The Emperor was his father, his god, the center of his universe. To be rejected by him so completely, so publicly, was a wound that cut far deeper than any physical injury ever could. And into that wound, poison was poured. Corphiron and Erebus, Lorgar's closest advisors, had secretly never abandoned the old faith of Colchis. That religion had been tainted by chaos long before Lorgar fell from the sky as an infant, and both men had been aware of the existence of the warp gods, even if they did not fully understand what they were. They had gone along with Lorgar's emperor worship, seeing it as a useful stepping stone, but now they saw an opportunity. They whispered to Lorgar in his despair, if the emperor was not divine, if he was not worthy of worship, then perhaps there were other powers that were. Powers that actually wanted devotion, that welcomed fervent faith, that would not reject those who sought to serve them. The Chaos Gods, they suggested, were real gods, beings of genuine divine power, who demanded and rewarded true worship. Unlike the Emperor, who rejected faith, these gods would embrace it. At first, Lorgar resisted. He was devastated, but his loyalty to the Emperor, to his father, ran deep. He loved the Emperor, even if that love was now painful and confused. But Corphiron and Erebus were patient, and they had time. They encouraged Lorgar to seek answers, to undertake a pilgrimage to discover if there truly were powers in the universe worthy of worship. And slowly, step by step, they guided him toward chaos. The pilgrimage of Lorgar took him deep into the Eye of Terror, that vast warp storm where the barriers between real space and the Imperium were thin. There, he encountered demons and chaos entities who showed him visions of the warp gods. They explained that chaos was not evil, but simply the truth of the universe, the fundamental forces that underlay all reality. They revealed that the Emperor had lied about the nature of existence, that gods did exist, that faith and devotion were not superstition, but recognition of genuine cosmic powers. More crucially, they showed Lorgar a vision of the future. In this vision, he saw the Imperium 10,000 years hence, a nightmarish realm where the Emperor was worshipped as a god by trillions of fanatical believers, where ignorance and superstition reigned supreme, where the entire human species was enslaved to a regime built on lies and oppression. The irony was profound. The Emperor, who had tried to free humanity from religion, had instead become the central figure of the most oppressive faith in human history. What Lorgar did not understand, what the Chaos Gods carefully concealed from him, was that this vision was not inevitable. It was a possible future, yes, but one that would only come to pass if Horus betrayed the Emperor, if the heresy tore the Imperium apart, if the Emperor was mortally wounded and entombed in the Golden Throne. The terrible theocratic Imperium of the 41st Millennium would be born from the civil war that Lorgar himself was about to set in motion. The Chaos Gods were showing him the consequences of his own future actions and presenting them as proof that the Emperor's vision had always been doomed to fail. But Lorgar believed what he was shown. He became convinced that chaos was the truth, that the Chaos Gods were worthy of worship, and that the Emperor was either a tyrant who needed to be stopped or a fool whose dream of a rational Imperium could never succeed. His loyalty to his father curdled into bitter resentment. If the Emperor would not accept his devotion, then Lorgar would find gods who would. The word-bearers returned to the Great Crusade after their period of withdrawal, but they were changed. On the surface, they appeared to have learned their lesson. They conquered worlds more quickly now, showing none of their previous slowness. They seemed grim and determined, perhaps chastened by their humiliation, but resolved to prove themselves worthy once more. The Emperor, observing from distant terror, appears to have been satisfied that his lesson had been learned. He could not have been more wrong. The word-bearers had not abandoned religion. They had simply changed which gods they served. For over 40 years, the word-bearers worked in secret to spread the corruption of chaos throughout the Legion as Astartes. They established warrior lodges within other legions, seemingly harmless fraternal organizations where Space Marines could gather outside the formal chain of command, discussing philosophy and building brotherhood. These lodges had been inspired by the tribal warriors of Davin, a world the Lunar Wolves had brought into compliance, where such organizations were central to their culture. The warrior lodges seemed innocent at first. They gave Space Marines a space to voice concerns and doubts that they might not feel comfortable raising through official channels. They built bonds between brothers that transcended squad and company assignments. They provided a social structure that helped warriors cope with the isolation and trauma of endless warfare. Many legions embraced them, seeing no harm in allowing their warriors this outlet. But the lodges had been corrupted from the start. The word-bearers' chaplains, spread throughout the legions as part of the Warrior Lodge network, subtly guided the discussions in these gatherings. They planted seeds of doubt about the Emperor's vision, questions about what role the Space Marines would have in a peacetime Imperium, concerns about the Council of Terror and what it meant for the Legion's future. They never pushed too hard, never openly advocated rebellion, but they ensured that the doubts grew, that the questions multiplied, that the bonds of loyalty to the Emperor weakened, just slightly, year after year. Most crucially, the warrior lodges identified those Space Marines in each legion who were most loyal to the Imperium itself, most dedicated to the Emperor above their Primarch. These loyalists were carefully noted, their names recorded, their positions within the Legion documented. When the time came, when the heresy began, these loyal warriors would be the first to die, betrayed by their own brothers, eliminated before they could warn the Emperor of the treachery to come. But spreading doubt throughout the legions was only part of Lorgar's plan. His true goal was to corrupt the Primarchs themselves, to turn the Emperor's sons against their father. And the keystone of that plan was Horus. Lorgar understood that Horus was crucial. He was the War Master, the Emperor's most beloved son, the Primarch whom others looked up to and followed. If Horus fell, others would follow. His betrayal would shatter the Imperium more completely than any other Primarchs could. He was the linchpin that, if removed, would bring the entire structure crashing down. But Horus was also the most difficult target. He was utterly loyal to the Emperor, devoted to his father with a sincerity that appeared unshakable. He had no obvious weakness that could be exploited, no festering resentment like Mortarian's hatred of tyrants, no rage like Angron's, no paranoia like Kersey's. He was balanced, rational, dedicated. How could such a paragon be turned? Lorgar and Erebus crafted a plan of exquisite cunning. They could not simply present Horus with arguments and expect him to turn traitor. They needed to create circumstances that would break down his defenses, that would exploit weaknesses Horus himself did not know he possessed. They needed to bring him to the absolute brink of death, to a point where his spirit was vulnerable and could be plunged into the warp itself, where the Chaos Gods could work their corruption directly upon his soul. And they needed a weapon. Not just any weapon, but one specifically designed to harm a Primarch in ways that normal weapons could not. They needed something that would not just wound Horus's body, but would poison him, infect him, bring him so close to death that the only cure would be to accept the aid of chaos. They found that weapon in the Anathami, and in acquiring it, they set in motion the chain of events that would doom the Imperium. The Blade of Betrayal, the Anathami. The Anathami was no ordinary sword. It was a weapon crafted by the Kynabrach, an alien species of considerable sophistication, who had once been allies of an advanced human civilization called the Interrex. The Kynabrach understood chaos, or as they called it, chaos, and they knew how to forge weapons using the warp's power. The Anathami was one such creation, a blade that could be attuned to a specific individual, given their name, and then used to inflict wounds that would not heal through normal means. The Interrex, understanding the danger such weapons represented, had confiscated all the Anathamies they could find from the Kynabrach and locked them away in their museum on the world of Zenobia. They kept them as warnings, examples of technology too dangerous to be used, reminders of the corruption that could come from tampering with the powers of the warp. When the 63rd Expeditionary Fleet, commanded by Horus himself, made contact with the Interrex, it seemed like it might be the Great Crusade's greatest diplomatic triumph. The Interrex were an advanced human civilization, one that had survived the age of strife and maintained a stable society. Unlike most human worlds, which had regressed into barbarism or been enslaved by alien overlords, the Interrex had thrived. They even maintained peaceful relations with their alien neighbors, including the Kynabrach. The Interrex were willing to talk. They saw the Imperium as potential allies, though they were deeply concerned by the Imperium's xenocidal policies and its apparent ignorance of the threat posed by chaos. They tried to warn Horus about what they called chaos, about the entities that dwelt in the warp and how they could corrupt even the most well-intentioned individuals. They showed the Imperial delegation their museum, including the locked vault where dangerous chaos artifacts were kept. Erebus, traveling with the fleet as a chaplain of the Word-Bearers, saw his opportunity. While the diplomatic talks continued, he broke into the museum and stole one of the Anathamies. He destroyed the hall in the process, making it look like a devastating act of vandalism. When the Interrex discovered the theft and the destruction, they immediately turned on the Imperial delegation, believing that the Imperium had been corrupted by chaos and had come to steal their most dangerous weapons. The battle that followed was tragic. The Interrex, who might have become valuable allies, were destroyed by the Lunar Wolves. who believed they had been unjustly attacked. The diplomatic mission ended in blood and fire, with an entire civilization wiped out, and Erebus quietly slipped away with the anathami, the weapon that would wound a Primarch. The blade then made its way to Davin, a feral world that the Lunar Wolves had brought into compliance decades earlier. The governor of Davin, Yugen Temba, had been left in charge with a garrison of Imperial army troops to maintain order and prepare the world for full integration into the Imperium. It should have been a straightforward assignment, a reward for a loyal servant, a posting that would let him help uplift a primitive world into the glory of Imperial civilization. But Davin had a dark secret. The world's people practiced ancient religions that were, unknown to the Imperials, tainted by chaos. Specifically, they worshipped something they called Nurgleth, which was in truth the chaos god Nurgle, the lord of decay and disease. The warrior lodges on Davin were not innocent fraternal organizations, but secret cults dedicated to the ruinous powers. Over the years, Temba and his garrison were exposed to this corruption. The influence was subtle at first, but Nurgle's touch is patient and insidious. By the time the Lunar Wolves returned to Davin to check on their old conquest, Temba had been thoroughly corrupted, transformed into a bloated, diseased monster who had turned away from the Imperium and now served the plague god. Erebus had given Temba the anathema. He had taught the corrupted governor how to use it, how to speak Horus's name to the blade so that it would be attuned to the War Master specifically. Then, he had ensured that Horus would be drawn to Davin, that circumstances would unfold in exactly the right way to bring the War Master face to face with the weapon designed to kill him. When reports reached Horus that Davin had fallen into rebellion, he was personally offended. This was a world that the Lunar Wolves had conquered and supposedly civilized. The fact that it had turned against the Imperium so completely was an insult to his legion's honor. He decided to handle the matter personally, leading a force to Davin's moon where Temba's forces had gathered. The mission should have been routine. Horus was a Primarch, a being of immense power and near invulnerability. Temba, for all his corruption, was just a mortal man, even if he had been twisted by Nurgle's gifts. But Erebus had planned carefully, arranging circumstances so that Horus would be separated from the bulk of his forces, trapped in the wreckage of Temba's crashed starship, forced to face the corrupted governor in close combat. The battle was brief but catastrophic. Temba, driven by unnatural strength and speed that his bloated form should not have possessed, fought with desperate fury. Horus, disgusted by what his former ally had become, struck him down with contemptuous ease. But in the final moments, as Temba died, he managed to drive the anathema through a gap in Horus's armor, stabbing the Primarch in the shoulder. It was a shallow wound, barely more than a scratch by the standards of what a Primarch could endure. Horus killed Temba immediately after and thought little of it. His superhuman physiology should have healed the injury within hours, leaving not even a scar. But the anathema was no ordinary blade, and the wound it inflicted was no ordinary injury. The blade had been attuned to Horus specifically. When it cut him, it did more than simply damage his flesh. It injected a poison directly into his system, a corruption that could not be purged by normal means. More than that, it created a connection between Horus's soul and the warp, a tether that would allow chaos to reach directly into the War Master's spirit. Within hours, Horus collapsed. His Laraman cells, the specialized organs that normally clotted a Space Marine's wounds within seconds, were not functioning. Blood poured from the shoulder wound that refused to close. Fever racked his body as his enhanced immune system went into overdrive, trying to fight off an infection that was spiritual as much as physical. The apothecaries of the Sons of Horus tried everything in their arsenal, every medical technology the Imperium possessed, but nothing worked. Horus was dying. The Primarch, whom many considered all but immortal, was dying from a single sword wound that should have been trivial, and no one could save him. Except, of course, for those who had engineered the entire situation. Erebus appeared aboard the Vengeful Spirit, Horus's flagship, in the guise of a concerned ally. He expressed horror at the War Master's condition and suggested a desperate solution. On Davin's surface, there was a temple dedicated to the Serpent Lodge, a group of healers who practiced ancient arts that might be able to cure Horus where Imperial medicine had failed. It was their only hope, Erebus claimed. Without their intervention, the War Master would surely die. The warrior lodge on the Vengeful Spirit, already corrupted by decades of subtle manipulation by the word-bearers, supported Erebus's suggestion. They argued passionately that any chance to save Horus should be taken, regardless of how unorthodox the methods might seem. Some of Horus's closest advisors, the group known as the Mournival, were divided. Garviel Loken, one of the most loyal of the Lunar Wolves, opposed the idea, sensing something wrong about the entire situation. But he was overruled by the majority, who could not bear the thought of standing by while their Primarch died. Horus was taken to the Temple of the Serpent Lodge on Davin. The building was massive, ancient, covered in carvings and symbols that should have warned anyone with knowledge of chaos what they were dealing with. Inside, the cultists of the lodge prepared their ritual, ostensibly to heal the War Master, in reality to complete the corruption that had begun with the anatheme's cut. They laid Horus upon a great altar and began their ceremony. The ritual was chaos sorcery, powered by the psychic energy of the cultists and channeled through artifacts dedicated to the ruinous powers. On the physical level, the ritual did nothing. Horus's body remained as it was, his wound still bleeding, his fever still raging. But spiritually, something profound happened. Horus's soul was torn from his dying body and cast into the warp itself, into the abyss. The corruption of a War Master. The warp is not a place meant for mortal minds. It is the Imperium, the Sea of Souls, a realm where thought and emotion become reality, where the laws of physics hold no sway, and where the entities that dwell there feed upon the psychic energy of living beings. For a normal human to be cast into the warp without protection would mean instant death, or worse, their soul devoured by the predatory entities that lurked there, or twisted into something unrecognizable by the tides of raw emotion that constantly washed through that realm. But Horus was no normal human. He was a Primarch, being crafted by the Emperor, using his own genetic material, and infused with power drawn from the warp itself. His soul burned with the brilliance of a star, a psychic beacon of immense power and clarity. He could survive in the warp, where others would be instantly destroyed. But survival did not mean safety. The Chaos Gods had been waiting for this moment. They had orchestrated it, guided every step that brought Horus to this point, arranged circumstances with infinite patience, so that the War Master would be vulnerable at precisely the right time. Now, with his soul torn from his dying body and cast into their domain, they could finally work their corruption upon him directly. But they were subtle in their approach. They did not appear as horrific monstrosities or reveal themselves as the malevolent entities they were. Instead, they showed Horus a familiar face, one he trusted above almost all others. Hastur Sejanus, one of his closest friends and advisors, a lunar wolf who had died honorably in battle months before. The figure of Sejanus appeared before Horus in the warp, speaking with his voice, showing his face, radiating the warmth and loyalty that the real Sejanus had possessed. He told Horus that he had been waiting, that he had been watching over the War Master since his death, and that he had urgent warnings to deliver about terrible truths that had been hidden from Horus. It was, of course, not Sejanus. It was Erebus, using sorcery to assume his form, speaking with the credibility of a trusted friend to deliver lies that Horus might otherwise have rejected. And the lies were carefully crafted to exploit every doubt, every fear, every insecurity that Horus had developed since the Emperor had left the Great Crusade. The false Sejanus showed Horus visions of the future, but these were not true visions. They were carefully constructed lies, images designed to make Horus believe that the emperor had always been a tyrant, that his vision for humanity was one of oppression and control, and that everything Horus had fought for was based on deception. In these visions, Horus saw the Imperium 10,000 years hence. He saw a galaxy-spanning theocracy where the emperor was worshipped as a god by trillions of fanatical believers. He saw the ecclesiarchy, the massive church dedicated to emperor worship, dominating the lives of every human in the Imperium. He saw the Inquisition, an organization of fanatics who hunted down anyone suspected of heresy and burned them alive. He saw a regime of ignorance and superstition, where science had been replaced by prayer, where progress had been abandoned in favor of fearful stagnation, where humanity lived in constant terror of alien threats and internal purges. This was, of course, a vision of the actual future, the grim darkness of the 41st millennium. But what Horus was not told was that this future would only come to pass if he betrayed the emperor. The theocratic nightmare he was being shown was the direct result of the Horus heresy, not something that would have happened anyway. The Chaos Gods were showing him the consequences of his own future actions and claiming they were inevitable, that this was always what the emperor had intended. The false Sejanus explained that the emperor had never wanted rational civilization or human progress. He had always intended to establish himself as a god, to be worshipped by all of humanity. The entire Great Crusade, all the talk about the imperial truth and freeing humanity from superstition, had been a lie to gain power. Once that power was secured, the emperor would reveal his true intentions and establish himself as the deity at the center of a galactic religion. To support this claim, Horus was shown more visions. He saw the emperor working in secret beneath the imperial palace on Terra, engaging in what looked like sorcery, using the same warp powers that he had forbidden others to use. This was the Webway project, of course, but Horus had no context to understand what he was seeing. To him, it looked like hypocrisy, the emperor using the very powers he had declared forbidden. The false Sejanus explained that the emperor had used warp sorcery to create the Primarchs themselves. This was true, though not in the way it was presented. The emperor had indeed used knowledge of the warp and immense psychic power to forge his sons, but he had done so to create beings capable of leading humanity's expansion, not to enslave them. But to Horus, hearing this for the first time and seeing it presented as a dark secret, it seemed like confirmation that the emperor had been lying about the nature of the warp all along. More damning visions followed. Horus saw the Council of Terror, that body of bureaucrats and administrators that had replaced the War Council. But instead of seeing it as an attempt at civilian governance, Horus saw it as evidence that the emperor was casting aside the Primarchs, replacing his sons with lesser beings who would be easier to control. The false Sejanus whispered that the Primarchs were always meant to be temporary, tools to be used during the conquest and then discarded once they were no longer needed. Horus saw visions of what would happen to the Space Marine legions once the Great Crusade was complete. He saw them disbanded, broken up into smaller chapters, scattered across the galaxy in permanent garrison duty, while the Council of Terror ruled the Imperium. He saw his legion reduced to peacekeepers, no longer the glorious conquerors they had been, watching while others reaped the benefits of what they had won through blood and sacrifice. The false Sejanus claimed that this had always been the plan. The emperor had never intended for the Primarchs to rule the Imperium they had conquered. He had created them as weapons, and weapons were to be put away once the war was won. The formation of the Council of Terror was not preparation for civilian governance, but rather the first step in removing the Primarchs from power. Soon, they would be marginalized completely, reduced to figurehead generals, while real authority rested with bureaucrats who knew nothing of what had been sacrificed to build the Imperium. And in all these visions of the future, Horus was conspicuously absent. He saw his brothers, some of them being worshipped alongside the emperor in that nightmarish theocracy. He saw statues and monuments to various primarchs, temples dedicated to their memory. But he did not see himself. His name was not spoken. His achievements were not remembered. It was as if he had never existed, as if the war master who had led the Great Crusade to its completion had been erased from history entirely. This was perhaps the cruelest lie of all, and the one most calculated to wound Horus where he was vulnerable. For all his loyalty, for all his devotion to the Emperor and the Great Crusade, Horus possessed the very human flaw of pride. He wanted to be remembered. He wanted his achievements to matter. He had conquered more worlds than almost any other Primarch, had served longer and more loyally than any of his brothers. He was the War Master, the chosen son, the one the Emperor had elevated above all others, and the thought that all of this might be forgotten, that he might be written out of history while others were remembered, struck at the core of his identity. The false Sejanus explained why Horus would be forgotten. The Emperor, knowing that Horus was too loyal, too devoted, had decided that the War Master would need to be eliminated once the Great Crusade was complete. Horus would never accept the marginalization of the Primarchs. He would fight to protect his brothers and the legions he loved. Therefore, he would be removed, killed in some false battle, or purged quietly, erased from history so completely that future generations would never even know he had existed. It was all lies. Every word was calculated to exploit Horus's insecurities, to play upon his fears, to transform his devotion into doubt and his loyalty into suspicion. The Chaos Gods were master manipulators, and they had studied Horus for decades, learning his every weakness, finding the precise words that would poison his mind most effectively. But lies work best when they are wrapped around kernels of truth, and there was enough truth in what Horus was being told to make the lies believable. The Emperor had returned to Terra for secret purposes he would not explain. The Council of Terra had been formed without Primarch input. The warrior lodges had been spreading rumors about the Space Marines being disbanded after the Crusade. All of these facts could be interpreted in the sinister light that Chaos was presenting them, and Horus, vulnerable and dying, struggling to make sense of what he was seeing, found himself believing. Throughout the vision, Horus maintained some resistance. He knew something was wrong, knew that this could not be the complete truth. At one point, he recognized that the figure before him was not truly Sejanus, that this was some form of deception. He rejected the lies, declared that he would not be fooled, that he knew his father and trusted in the Emperor's vision. But doubt is a poison that works slowly. Even as Horus rejected the explicit lies, even as he tried to hold on to his loyalty, the seeds had been planted. The questions raised could not be easily answered. Why had the Emperor returned to Terra without explanation? Why was he working on secret projects using warp powers? Why had the Council of Terra been formed without Primarch representation? These were real questions that Horus had been struggling with for years, and the Chaos Gods had simply provided answers that played to his worst fears. Moreover, Horus was dying. His physical body lay on an altar on Davin, bleeding out from a wound that would not heal. The cultists of the Serpent Lodge were offering him a choice: accept the power of the Chaos Gods and live, or reject it and die. His soul, cast into the warp, was being slowly dissolved by the energies there. Without intervention, without protection, he would cease to exist entirely. The Chaos Gods presented themselves as his salvation. They claimed to be the true powers of the universe, the fundamental forces that underlay reality itself. They were not evil, they insisted, merely misunderstood. The Emperor had lied about them because he feared their power, because he wanted to be the only god, the only power that humanity followed. But they were willing to accept Horus, to grant him power beyond imagining, to heal him and make him stronger than he had ever been. All he had to do was swear allegiance to them. All he had to do was accept that the Emperor had betrayed him first. All he had to do was agree to help them overthrow the false tyrant and replace his regime of lies with something more honest, more worthy of the sacrifices that the Primarchs and their legions had made. In his weakened state, torn between dying and accepting this dark bargain, shown vision after vision of what he believed to be the truth, Horus made his choice. He accepted the offer. He swore himself to the service of chaos, believing that he was doing so to save humanity from the Emperor's tyranny, rather than to betray everything he had fought for. The moment he agreed, power flooded into him. The Chaos Gods, who had been patient for so long, finally claimed their prize. Horus's wound healed instantly. His physical body, lying on the altar in the Temple of the Serpent Lodge, sat up, restored to health beyond even his normal capabilities. His soul returned from the warp, but it did not return unchanged. It was tainted now, corrupted by chaos, bound to the ruinous powers by oaths he had sworn in a moment of weakness and confusion. When Horus opened his eyes, they were different. His warriors, gathered around him in joy at his miraculous recovery, did not immediately notice the change. He stood, spoke of his gratitude to the Serpent Lodge for saving him, and declared that he was ready to return to the crusade. On the surface, he seemed to be the same Horus they had always known. But something fundamental had changed. The War Master, who had loved the Emperor above all else, who had been loyal beyond question, who had never wavered in his devotion to his father's vision, was gone. In his place stood a being who believed he had discovered a terrible truth, that he had been betrayed by the one he trusted most, and that he had a responsibility to stop the Emperor's tyranny before it could consume all of humanity. The Horus who walked away from the Temple of the Serpent Lodge was determined to save the Imperium. He just intended to do it by destroying the Emperor and everything the Emperor had built. The psychology of betrayal. What Horus actually wanted. To truly understand why Horus betrayed the Emperor, we must look beyond the manipulation of chaos and examine the psychological foundation that made that manipulation effective. The Chaos Gods could not have corrupted Horus if there were not already cracks in his loyalty, doubts buried so deep that perhaps even Horus himself was not consciously aware of them. The visions shown to him in the warp worked because they touched upon fears and insecurities that had always been present, simply waiting for the right catalyst to bring them to the surface. At the heart of Horus's fall was the question of his own identity and purpose. He had been created for a specific role, to lead the Great Crusade, to conquer the galaxy in the Emperor's name, to reunify humanity under a single banner. Everything about his design, from his superhuman intelligence to his unmatched charisma, was optimized for this purpose. He was a weapon, yes, but also a leader, a general, a visionary in his own right. He had been given enough autonomy to make strategic decisions, enough independence to shape how worlds were brought into compliance, enough authority to command even his brother Primarchs when the situation demanded it. But what would happen when the Great Crusade was over? This question haunted not just Horus, but all the Primarchs, though they dealt with it in different ways. Some, like Guilliman, were already building empires that could transition into peacetime prosperity. Others, like Angron, seemed to exist only for war and could not imagine any other purpose. Still others, like Mortarion, hoped that the end of the crusade would mean freedom to build the kinds of societies they believed in. For Horus, the question was particularly acute because his entire identity was wrapped up in being the War Master. Without the Great Crusade, what was he? Would he become just another general, assigned to garrison duties and border patrols? Would he be expected to step aside gracefully while civilian administrators took control of the Imperium he had helped conquer? Would his role become ceremonial, a figurehead whose real power was stripped away? These fears were not unfounded. The formation of the Council of Terror suggested exactly such a future, where military leaders like the Primarchs would be subordinate to civilian authority. And while this might have been appropriate for running an interstellar empire, it represented a profound demotion for beings who had been created to lead, who had spent 2 centuries as the most powerful and respected individuals in human civilization. Horus wanted to matter. This basic human need drove much of his decision-making, even if he did not consciously acknowledge it. He needed to know that his sacrifices were meaningful, that his achievements would be remembered, that his service to the Emperor and to humanity was valued. The visions shown to him in the warp played perfectly upon this need by suggesting that not only would he not be remembered, but he would be actively erased, removed from history as an inconvenient reminder of a more martial past. But there was something deeper driving Horus, something that perhaps even the Chaos Gods did not fully understand. He genuinely loved humanity. For all his pride and ambition, for all his desire for recognition and glory, Horus believed in the Imperial dream. He had spent 2 centuries fighting to unite human civilization, bringing scattered colonies back into the fold, liberating worlds from alien oppression and warlord tyrants. He had seen the worst that could happen when humanity was divided, when Xenos predators hunted human worlds with impunity, when ignorance and superstition kept entire populations trapped in darkness. The Great Crusade had been about more than just conquest. It represented hope, the promise that humanity could rise above its fractured past and build something glorious. Horus believed in that promise. He believed in the vision of a united human civilization, free from alien threats, advancing through knowledge and reason toward a better future. That vision was worth fighting for. It was worth the sacrifices, worth the blood and death, worth 2 centuries of constant warfare. When the Chaos Gods showed him their carefully constructed visions of the future, when they presented the nightmare theocracy of the 41st Millennium as the inevitable result of the Emperor's plans, Horus was genuinely horrified. If this was what the Emperor was working toward, if this was the future that awaited humanity, then everything Horus had fought for was a lie. The promised enlightenment would become oppression. The dream of progress would become stagnant superstition. The liberation would become slavery to a cosmic tyrant who demanded worship and crushed dissent with religious fervor. From this perspective, from Horus's corrupted understanding of what he had been shown, his betrayal was not a betrayal at all. It was an attempt to save humanity from a terrible fate. The Emperor had to be stopped before he could establish his theocratic dictatorship. The vision of a rational, enlightened Imperium had to be preserved, even if that meant removing the Emperor from power. Someone had to stand up and say that the path humanity was on would lead to disaster. And if the Emperor would not listen to reason, then he would have to be removed by force. Of course, this was exactly backwards. The theocratic nightmare that Horus was shown would only come into existence because of his betrayal. If he had remained loyal, if the heresy had never happened, the Imperium might have become something far different, potentially closer to the enlightened civilization the Emperor actually envisioned. But corrupted by chaos, shown carefully selected and falsified visions, Horus could not see this. He believed he was acting to prevent catastrophe, not to cause it. This self-justification is crucial to understanding Horus's actions after he emerged from the Temple of the Serpent Lodge. He did not see himself as a traitor. He saw himself as a revolutionary, as someone willing to make the hard choices that others were too loyal or too blind to make. He was not betraying the dream of the Great Crusade. He was saving it from the Emperor's corruption. He was not turning his back on humanity. He was fighting for humanity's true freedom. But beneath this rationalization, beneath the corruption that had poisoned his mind, there were other motives that Horus himself might not have fully acknowledged. The ambitious part of him, the prideful part that wanted glory and recognition, whispered that if the Emperor had to be removed, then someone else would need to rule the Imperium. And who better than Horus himself, the war master who had commanded the Great Crusade to its completion, who had the loyalty of the legions and the respect of his brothers. If the Emperor's vision was flawed, then Horus would provide a better one. He would build the Imperium as it should have been built all along. This was perhaps the greatest cruelty of his corruption. Horus believed he was acting altruistically, sacrificing his relationship with his father and risking everything for the good of humanity, when in truth, he was being manipulated into serving the very powers he thought he was fighting against. The Chaos Gods had convinced him that they were simply natural forces, fundamental aspects of the universe that had been demonized by the Emperor because he feared them. They had presented themselves as allies in his quest to build a better Imperium, offering power and support without revealing that their ultimate goal was the destruction of human civilization itself. The tragedy of Horus's fall was that it came from the same qualities that had made him great. His love for humanity, his desire to matter, his willingness to make hard choices, his belief that he could shape the future for the better, all of these aspects of his character were turned against him. The Chaos Gods understood that you cannot corrupt a purely evil being. They are already aligned with chaos. To truly damn a soul, you must twist virtue into vice, turn love into hate, make someone believe that the road to hell is paved with good intentions. Horus truly believed he was doing the right thing when he began his rebellion. He believed he was saving humanity from tyranny. He believed the Emperor had betrayed everything the Great Crusade stood for. And this belief, this conviction that he was acting righteously, would sustain him through the horrors to come, even as he committed atrocities that would have appalled the Horus who had served loyally for 2 centuries. The question of whether Horus's fall could have been prevented is one that scholars of the heresy have debated for 10 millennia. If the Emperor had shared his plans for the Webway project with Horus, would that have prevented the doubt that made him vulnerable? If the Council of Terror had included Primarch representation, would that have eased the fears about being cast aside? If someone had recognized Erebus's manipulation and exposed the Wordbearer's corruption before it spread throughout the legions, could the conspiracy have been stopped? Perhaps. But the Chaos Gods are patient, and they had woven a web with multiple redundancies. If one path to corrupting Horus had been blocked, they would have found another. They had been working toward this goal for decades, perhaps for centuries, planting seeds and arranging circumstances with infinite patience. The fall of a Primarch, especially this Primarch, was too important to leave to chance. What is certain is that by the time Horus walked out of the temple of the Serpent Lodge, the Imperium's fate was sealed. The greatest civil war in human history was about to begin, and when it ended, the dream of the Great Crusade would lie in ruins. The Emperor would be entombed in the Golden Throne, barely clinging to a twilight existence between life and death, and humanity would be plunged into an age of darkness from which it has never recovered. All because the Emperor's most beloved son believed he was doing the right thing. The beginning of the end. After his recovery on Davin, Horus moved with shocking swiftness to transform his newfound convictions into action. The War Master, who had been utterly loyal to the Emperor just weeks before now, began carefully orchestrating the greatest betrayal in human history. But he was not reckless. Horus understood that a direct assault on Terra, a public declaration of rebellion, would fail. The Emperor was too powerful, the Imperial forces too numerous, the loyalty of most legions too strong. He needed allies, and he needed them to come to him willingly, believing, as he now believed, that the Emperor had to be stopped. Over the following months, Horus reached out to his brother Primarchs with careful, calculated arguments, tailored to each one's particular grievances and insecurities. To Mortarion, he spoke of tyrants and how the Emperor was becoming the very thing they had fought against. To Angron, he offered the promise of endless war and the freedom to unleash his rage without the Emperor's restrictions. To Fulgrim, he played upon perfectionist obsessions and the desire to achieve heights beyond what the Emperor would allow. To the already corrupted Lorgar, he revealed that he too had seen the truth of the Chaos Gods and was ready to embrace their power. Not all were convinced. Some Primarchs, like Sanguinius and Ferrus Manus, remained utterly loyal. Others, like Guilliman and Dawn, could not be swayed by Horus's arguments, but enough sided with him, bringing their legions into what would become the traitor cause. The Wordbearers, who had orchestrated everything. The World Eaters, who craved battle above all else. The Emperor's children, seduced by the promise of perfection through chaos. The Death Guard, convinced that the Emperor's vision was corrupt. And others, each for their own reasons, each believing they were doing what was necessary. But within each legion, not all warriors accepted their Primarch's turn to rebellion. Many Space Marines remained loyal to the Emperor, above even their gene fathers. These loyalists represented a problem for Horus. If his rebellion was to succeed, he could not allow these potential enemies to warn the Emperor or rally opposition from within. They had to be eliminated quietly, before the heresy began in earnest. The solution was brutal and elegant. Horus declared his intention to bring the world of Istvan III into compliance. The planetary governor had supposedly declared independence from the Imperium, and the War Master was assembling forces to crush this rebellion. It was a routine operation, the kind of action that had been performed thousands of times during the Great Crusade. No one questioned it, but Horus sent only specific warriors to the surface, those from the Sons of Horus, World Eaters, Emperor's children, and Death Guard, who had remained loyal to the Emperor, who had not joined the warrior lodges, who could not be trusted to follow their Primarchs into rebellion. Under the guise of a standard planetary assault, he gathered all the potential dissidents in one place, isolated them from their fleets, and then betrayed them in the most horrific way imaginable. Virus bombs fell from orbit, unleashing a biological weapon called the Life Eater virus. It was one of the most terrible weapons in the Imperial arsenal, capable of consuming all biological matter on a planetary surface within hours. The Loyalist Space Marines on Istvan III fought desperately to survive, warned at the last moment by Saul Tarvitz of the Emperor's Children and Nathaniel Garrow of the Death Guard, who had discovered the plot and tried to save who they could. For months, the Loyalists held out against impossible odds, fighting not against Xenos or rebels, but against their own brothers who had turned traitor. Eventually, they were all killed, either in combat or by orbital bombardment when Horus grew tired of waiting. Their deaths marked the true beginning of the Horus heresy, the moment when there could be no turning back, when the Imperium was irreversibly divided into loyalist and traitor factions. The Emperor, distant on Terra and focused on the Webway project, did not learn of Horus's betrayal until it was far too late to stop what had been set in motion. By the time word reached him of what had happened at Istvan III, Horus had already begun the next phase of his plan, the drop site massacre at Istvan V, where he would destroy 3 entire loyalist legions in a single, treacherous ambush, dealing a blow from which the Imperium would never fully recover. The war that followed would rage across the galaxy for nearly a decade, consuming billions of lives, shattering the dream of the Great Crusade, and ultimately ending with both Horus and the Emperor mortally wounded in their final confrontation aboard the Vengeful Spirit. The Imperium survived, but it was transformed into something the Emperor had never intended, the theocratic nightmare that Horus had seen in his visions, the self-fulfilling prophecy that his own betrayal had brought into being. The terrible irony. Perhaps the cruelest aspect of Horus's betrayal is that everything he fought to prevent came to pass because of his actions, not despite them. The vision of a superstitious, theocratic Imperium that the Chaos Gods showed him, the nightmare future where the Emperor was worshipped as a god and humanity lived in ignorance and fear, became reality because Horus rebelled. If Horus had remained loyal, if the heresy had never happened, the Imperium might have become something very different. The Emperor's Webway project might have succeeded, freeing humanity from dependence on the warp and ushering in an age of unprecedented progress. The Council of Terra might have developed into a genuine civilian government that brought prosperity and enlightenment to the Imperium's worlds. The Space Marine legions might have transitioned into peacekeeping forces, protecting humanity without dominating it. Instead, the heresy shattered everything. The Emperor, forced to remain on the Golden Throne to hold back the demons that threatened to pour through the broken webway portal, could no longer guide humanity directly. The Imperium, traumatized by the betrayal of half the Space Marine legions, became paranoid and repressive, seeing potential traitors everywhere. The secular imperial truth, which had sought to free humanity from superstition, was replaced by the cult of the Emperor, which proclaimed him as the God Emperor and demanded religious devotion. Lorgar's book, the Lectitio Divinitatis, which had been written decades before the heresy to proclaim the Emperor's divinity, became the foundational text of this new faith. The very worship that the Emperor had rejected, that he had humiliated Lorgar for spreading, became the dominant belief system of the Imperium. Trillions of humans came to worship the Emperor as a god, despite him never wanting such worship, despite everything he had fought to prevent exactly this outcome. And Horus, who had rebelled to save humanity from this fate, became the architect of its creation. Every action he took to prevent the vision he had seen brought that vision closer to reality. It was a trap set by the Chaos Gods with exquisite cruelty, using Horus's love for humanity and his desire to do the right thing to damn humanity to 10,000 years of darkness. In the end, Horus did realize what he had become. When the Emperor finally confronted him aboard the Vengeful Spirit, when they faced each other in their final battle, Horus was fully possessed by the Chaos Gods, a vessel for their combined power. But in the last moments, when the Emperor struck him down with the power channeled through a shard of the very anathema that had first wounded him, there was a moment of clarity. Horus saw what he had done, understood the horror of his betrayal, recognized that he had been manipulated from the start. Whether he felt regret in those final moments, whether he understood that everything he had fought for had been a lie, remains unclear. The Emperor, seeing his beloved son finally freed from Chaos's grip, but knowing that the corruption ran too deep to be healed, obliterated Horus's soul completely, ensuring that not even the Chaos Gods could resurrect him. It was an act of mercy and necessity both, erasing Horus from existence so thoroughly that not even a ghost remained. Understanding the fall, the question, why did Horus betray the Emperor, has no single, simple answer. It was not one cause but a perfect storm of circumstances, each building upon the others until the weight became too much for even the greatest of Primarchs to bear. First, there was the Emperor's withdrawal from the Great Crusade and his refusal to explain why. This created doubt where none had existed before, making Horus question whether he truly had his father's trust, whether he truly understood the Emperor's vision, whether everything he had been fighting for was what he thought it was. The seeds of doubt were planted through this abandonment and silence. Second, there was the formation of the Council of Terror, which seemed to diminish the Primarchs just as the Great Crusade neared completion. This played upon fears about what role the Space Marines and their leaders would have in a peacetime Imperium, suggesting that they might be discarded once they were no longer needed for conquest. Third, there was the long conspiracy by Lorgar and the Wordbearers, spreading corruption through the warrior lodges, identifying and isolating loyalists who would have warned the Emperor, preparing the ground for rebellion decades before it actually began. This conspiracy ensured that when Horus fell, he would not stand alone, that other Primarchs would be ready to join him, that entire legions could be turned. Fourth, there was the anathema itself, the weapon that could wound a Primarch in ways normal weapons could not. Without that blade, Horus would never have been brought to the brink of death, would never have been vulnerable enough to be cast into the warp and shown the visions that corrupted him. Fifth, there were the visions themselves, lies wrapped in truth, designed with perfect understanding of Horus's psychology to exploit his every insecurity, to transform his love for humanity into a weapon against the Emperor, to convince him that betrayal was actually loyalty, that destruction was actually salvation. Sixth, there was Horus's own character, his pride and ambition, his need to matter and be remembered, his desire for his achievements to be valued. Without these very human flaws, the Chaos God's manipulation would not have worked. They could only corrupt him because there was something in him to corrupt, weaknesses that existed despite his loyalty and love for his father. And finally, there was the fundamental tragedy of misunderstanding. If the Emperor had trusted Horus with the truth about the Webway project, if he had explained why he was withdrawing from the crusade and what he was trying to accomplish, would Horus have been vulnerable to corruption? Perhaps not. But the Emperor's necessary secrecy created a gulf between father and son that Chaos gleefully exploited. The real reason Horus betrayed the Emperor was that he believed he was doing the right thing. He believed he was saving humanity from tyranny. He believed the Emperor had become what they had always fought against. And by the time he realized the truth, it was far too late to undo the catastrophe he had unleashed. The legacy. 10,000 years later, the Imperium still bears the scars of Horus's betrayal. The Chaos Space Marines, the traitor legions who followed him into damnation, still wage war against the Imperium from the Eye of Terror and the scattered realms of chaos. They raid, they pillage, they corrupt, seeking to finish what Horus started and bring the Imperium to its knees. The Emperor sits upon the golden throne, neither truly alive nor dead, sustained by the sacrifice of 1,000 psykers every day. His mind stretched across the galaxy, maintaining the Astronomicon beacon that makes interstellar travel possible. He cannot speak, cannot move, cannot act directly to guide humanity as he once did. The cost of Horus's betrayal was the loss of the Emperor's direct leadership, and humanity has wandered in the darkness ever since. The Imperium Horus fought to prevent has come into being. It is a realm of superstition and fear, where innovation is suppressed, where the Inquisition hunts for traitors with fanatical zeal, where trillions worship the Emperor as a god despite him never wanting such worship. It is exactly what Horus saw in his visions, brought about by his own actions in trying to prevent it. But humanity endures. For all the darkness, for all the horrors that beset it on every side, the Imperium still stands. Billions of soldiers fight across countless worlds. The Space Marine chapters, descended from the loyal legions, defend humanity from Xenos and heretic alike. The Imperial Navy patrols the void, protecting the supply lines that keep 1 million worlds functioning. The Administratum struggles to govern an empire too vast to truly comprehend. It is not the glorious future the Emperor envisioned. It is not the enlightened civilization that Horus believed he was fighting for. But it is survival, and in the grim darkness of the far future, survival is the only victory that matters. The story of Horus Lupercal, the war master who betrayed his father and damned humanity to 10,000 years of war, stands as perhaps the greatest tragedy in human history. He was the best of his kind, the greatest of the Primarchs, loved by his father and respected by his brothers. And yet he fell, corrupted by powers he did not understand, manipulated into believing that betrayal was loyalty, that destruction was salvation, that the greatest love could justify the greatest crime. In the end, Horus wanted what anyone might want: to matter, to be valued, to see his sacrifices acknowledged, to build something lasting that would make the universe better. But in his fall, he learned the cruelest lesson the Warhammer 40,000 universe has to teach. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and sometimes the monsters we become are born from the heroes we once were. The Horus heresy reminds us that even the mightiest can fall, that corruption works not by attacking our weaknesses, but by twisting our strengths, that the greatest betrayals come not from our enemies, but from those we love most. It shows us that the line between hero and villain is thinner than we would like to believe, and that given the right circumstances, the right pressures, the right lies presented at the right time, even the best among us can become something terrible. This is why the Horus heresy remains the foundational event of the Warhammer 40,000 universe, why its consequences echo through 10 millennia, why its lessons still matter. Because it shows us not just the fall of a hero, but the fragility of everything we build, the terrible cost of miscommunication and misunderstanding, and the way that good intentions can pave the road to damnation. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this deep dive into the real reasons behind Horus's betrayal. The Horus heresy is perhaps the most complex and tragic story in all of Warhammer 40K, and understanding why the Warmaster fell requires looking at so many interlocking factors, from the manipulation of chaos to the very human flaws that made that manipulation effective. If you enjoyed this exploration of Warhammer 40K lore, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more deep dives into the grim darkness of the 41st Millennium. Let me know in the comments what aspect of the heresy you'd like me to cover next. Should we explore the other traitor, Primarchs, and why they fell? Dive into the Loyalist response and the heroes who held the Imperium together, or examine the Siege of Terror itself and that final, tragic confrontation between father and son. The lore of Warhammer 40K is deep and endlessly fascinating, and I'm here to bring you the most comprehensive looks at the stories that shape this incredible universe. Until next time, remember, in the grim darkness of the far future, there is only war, and it all began with one perfect son who believed he was doing the right thing.